In this video, we're going to be looking at the effect of rest on cardiac muscle. The procedure for this activity is shown in your lab notes, but let's go through it here. So we've got our muscle set up and now we're going to get a response. So we'll click Start, then Lab Chart records for 5 seconds. Now when Lab Chart stops recording, if you can't see the trace on the screen, generally that just means the trace is off the screen somewhere, and so click Auto Scale, either using this drop-down arrow here, or this button up here. And there's our response. Now that's looking pretty good, so let's click the macro up here to get our software recording. The left button is the one that we're using for this, and that will start the macro which will stimulate the muscle with 10 volts for 10 milliseconds, and it will do that every 30 seconds. The software then records for 5 seconds, and then you can see a little timer on the screen which then counts down 25 seconds until the next recording. If you recall, the instructions say to record until the readings become stable around 2 to 3 minutes, so we'll do that. Now I said this in the setup video earlier, but just as a reminder here, because the bubbles buffet the tissue and because the force transducer is extremely sensitive, in order to get nice clean recordings, we'll need to stop the bubbles for the 5 seconds that Lab Chart is actually recording the muscle contraction. So does that make sense? To stop the bubbles, just before Lab Chart starts the recording, just squeeze the tubing here, and then you should see the bubbles stop in the tissue bath. Okay, now for the sake of time, we've skipped ahead a few minutes here, and you can see for the last 5 recordings that the amplitude of the response has been very similar. And so basically our readings have become stabilized, and so we're right to turn off the macro and leave the muscle to sit unstimulated for 10 minutes. And so that's what we're going to do now. And then 10 minutes later, all we do is press the macro button again, and that will start the recordings once again every 30 seconds, and we'll see what happened after that long 10-minute rest. Now bear in mind this is quite an artificial situation. From the moment that your cardiomyocytes form as a developing embryo, and they form about 18 to 19 days after fertilization, so they actually form very early, your cardiac myocytes never stop beating until the day you die. And so you would never actually find yourself in this situation where your heart stops beating for about 10 minutes. We're looking at this situation in this experiment purely to study the physiology of cardiac muscle contraction, not necessarily to see what goes on in actual life. Alright then, now once again we let our macro keep stimulating the muscle until our recordings become stable. And once again you can see here that the previous 5 recordings are all pretty much just over the top of each other, so they've become stable again. So that's all we need, so we're going to stop the macro here. And now lastly, here's that same file opened up in Lab Chart Reader, and you can see that I've labeled the pages according to the phase of the experiment as asked for in your notes, so that way you can see which pages relate to which parts of the experiment.